Welcome to part one of a three-part presentation put together in PowerPoint and narrated by myself, Kenneth Ng, that I call Why Liberals and Conservatives Don't Understand Each Other. I myself am not a political scientist, I'm not a social scientist, nor am I a psychologist. I just find that our current political dynamic is so interesting, and I've been doing a lot of reading about it, and I thought it would be interesting to pull in ideas from up to a dozen books that I've been reading about this topic, and maybe add in a couple of my own ideas and try to see if we can make sense of politics in America. My intention is to talk fairly frankly about what each side of our political divide believes. It's not my intention in this presentation to take a centrist position and offer a middle ground perspective. I think that's important for us if we're going to understand each other on the two sides of our political divide, that we have a good understanding of where the center of gravity in each of the ideologies is. And so that's sort of what I'm going to be channeling as I explain what my understanding of what each side, the conservatives and the liberals in America, believe. Now, I'm hoping that you can accept that a person can explain a point of view without necessarily agreeing with that point of view. Understanding is the goal here, and that does not imply agreeing. And I don't believe that listening to opinions you would disagree with is ideological treason or anything. So, in this first part, what we're going to talk about is just where the belief systems of conservatives and liberals come from. And so in this part one, it's going to be a fairly detached way of looking at things, not a lot of controversial pieces to what I'm going to talk about. Now, like I said, it's a three-part series. So in the second part, we're going to be applying some of those principles that we talk about in part one. And at that point where I'm channeling the left and I'm channeling the right, there's going to be maybe some things that sound a little controversial. And then in part three, that's where I intend to actually start talking about our current political situation and how we got where we're at right now. So, sort of want to give an overview of what you would expect to see in this part one versus what's in part two and part three, just briefly. And as I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of what I'm doing here is just presenting what my synthesis of what I've learned in certain books and then trying to make sense, bringing it all together. And so the first book that I'm going to be referencing is this book that was written by Jonathan Haidt that's called The Righteous Mind. And one of the parts of that book that we're going to start out with is, I titled that part, Why It Is Unreasonable to Expect Reason to Prevail. Then we're going to reference the book Prius or Pickup and talk about two very different worldviews. And then the final part of part one, we're going to be referencing the book Moral Politics by George Lakoff. And in that, we're going to try to come to an understanding about two different secular moral systems that he has sort of pieced together. So that's the part one. If you want to kind of have an idea what will be talked about in part 2, which will be a separate recording, then we're going to get back into that book, Moral Politics, and we're going to apply the principles from part 1 to contemporary issues and go through sort of issue by issue, explain my understanding of the conservative point of view and of the liberal point of view, and maybe some tiebacks to some of these concepts that are discussed in Moral Politics. And then the second half of the part 2, I'm going to be reading extracts and summaries from the book, The Politics of Resentment. And we're going to be listening to basically how rural voters make sense of politics. In part 3, we're going to get into the current political situation and start off talking about why politics in the U.S. has become so toxic. This will be my attempt to explain the progression of this. And I'm going to be pulling some ideas from this book called Identity Crisis that was written about the 2016 campaign. And then after reliving that tumultuous event and the current political situation, then we're going to kind of back off a little and talk about how it might be possible to have constructive conversations about politics. And I thought there were some great insights in this book called The Political Brain by Drew Weston. So that's sort of how the 3 parts are going to be broken up. So let's go ahead and start in part 1. I want to sort of set the stage. I think that we are living in the middle of history right now. It's a very fascinating time from a political standpoint. And it's almost like we're living in the middle of a book or, a mystery thriller and or like a movie. The problem is that the plot is really confusing because it's told in 2 different languages. There's the way that conservatives talk about things and there's the way that liberals talk about things, and they're really hard for us to understand. And so it's hard to understand really what this book is really about. And my point will be that if we want to have any influence over this story, we need to learn how to interpret and speak both of those languages. So that's sort of the goal of this series. Now, I have a prediction about how this story, this political thriller, is not going to turn out. It is not going to end with the phrase, "and then the other side came to their senses." Both sides of our political divide have ideologies that make a lot of sense, and both sides now feel like they are in a death match, like that the other side is an existential threat to their political philosophy. And the point is that just as you personally probably don't think that you have lost your mind, then neither do those on the other side. They, like you, think that they have good reasons for believing the things they believe. So let's start getting oriented by looking at part of this book, The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, that was published in 2012. The first part we want to talk about here is where he concludes that intuition actually precedes reason. And he has this analogy of an elephant and a rider. And in this metaphor, the elephant embodies intuition or emotional reasoning, like gut feelings, And then there's this little rider on top that embodies reason. And the intuitions and the emotions are almost instantaneous. These are just almost like gut feelings that we have about many things. For instance, we have an intuitive sense about harm. We know right away whether to interpret something that we're seeing or hearing has an element of harm, and we have an intuitive sense about fairness. And these are pretty universal, and they're pretty intuitive. But the role of reason, the rider on the elephant, with the elephant embodying intuition, is the rider's job, reason's job, is actually to rationalize what the elephant concluded through the intuition or emotion, and we rationalize it after the fact. And this is pretty adaptive, actually. If we had to reason out every decision and every judgment all the time, social interactions would be so tedious and error prone, because you just can't think through, what do I think about that? What do I think about that? It's really actually good to have these intuitions and these gut feelings, because it just makes things go so much faster and easier. But reason, I think we sort of have to admit that it's rarely used internally to explore what is true and what is right. We don't sit down at the kitchen table and start talking ourselves out of what we believe. He concludes that reasoning is actually a tool to try to persuade other people that we are right. It's not a tool for our use. It's almost like a weapon. And he thinks that that we can't actually change people's minds by refuting their arguments. If you use reason against reason, you're probably not going to get anywhere. He says what you need to do is you need to talk to the elephant. You need to be talking in terms that the elephant understands, which are more intuitive than they are logic. And to be an effective persuader, you need to either elicit new intuitions, or you need to trigger some latent emotions that aren't currently prioritized. Now, I think this is very similar to this old adage that we've talked about for years about standing in some other person's shoes. And there was a quote, I believe it was in that book, that I thought really captured this pretty well and was worth just reviewing. It's a quote from Henry Ford, and he says, "If there is any one secret of success, it lies in the ability to get the other person's point of view and see things from their angle as well as from your own." I thought that was very wise. Now, I have an additional thing to say about this. This doesn't come from Henry Ford, but I actually think you should beware of taking other people's explanations at face value. I think they're probably only vaguely aware of why they believe something, and will usually have a hard time articulating the source of their beliefs. Now let's switch over to the book Prius or Pickup. And this is a book that tries to develop a model for understanding what is pretty much aligns with a conservative versus a liberal worldview, but instead what this book talks about is fixed worldviews or fixed mentalities and fluid mentalities. And this structure, this theory of the source of belief, starts with different worldviews. And in this fixed mentality that they're going to build a description of here, it starts with a worldview that the world is dangerous. So if in their definition, and we'll get to how you define these things, but if a fixed mentality is the people that their fundamental starting assumption about the world is that the world is dangerous. Whereas fluid mentality people, their fundamental view of the world is that the world is something to be experienced, which is kind of very, almost the opposite of thinking that the world is dangerous. There's a kind of a description of human nature that follows this, which is the fixed mentality with the worldview that the world is dangerous. It's the human nature to be kind of resistant to change and suspicious of outsiders, whereas over on the fluid mentality, where you think the world is to be experienced, it's their human nature to be open to new experiences and to actually value diversity. So there's preferences that these people in the different categories will have. If you're of the fixed mentality and you think the world is dangerous, what you prefer is conformity. You like to stick with what works, and you're attracted actually to black and white explanations. You like certainty. Whereas in a fluid mentality, you're more free thinking. You strive for continuous improvement in society, and you see nuance and complexity in almost everything. So this leads to certain motivations. In the fixed mentality, you're motivated to seek stability. You're motivated to, you like predictability. And I came up with this motto. It might have been referenced in the book, maybe not, but that the life motto here would be better safe than sorry. I think that's actually, it describes people that I know, maybe even myself. Fluid mentality, their motivations are different. They seek novelty. They don't tend to like to settle for just okay. They are always looking for the best and better and peak experiences. And their motto might be, try it, you might like it. So this describes really two different kinds of mentalities or personality types. And so there's a comfort zone for the fixed mentality, and their comfort zone is stability. And the comfort zone for fluid people is variety. And I think you could see that how this isn't exchangeable, that the fixed mentality people, what they really don't like is variety, and probably with the fluid people, what bores them to death is stability. Now, the book actually is drawing on some scientific research and insight that came through a book called Predisposed. And in that book, they were postulating that maybe there's a biological basis for our worldviews. And they are postulating that maybe some people actually are hardwired to be wary. And so in some of these experiments and tests, they were noticing that some people have senses that seem to be more attuned to danger. An example that they had was people that blink more often. This may be a sign that they're on guard and attuned to danger more than other people. There are people that are more easily and more dramatically startled. So those might be hardwired to be wary. There's also people that are more easily and dramatically disgusted, like with strong gag reflexes. Again, that's biological, and that's sort of a feeling of wariness or a defensive reaction. And then they also observed that there seems to be a correlation that people with a larger amygdala, which is the part of the brain that controls survival instincts, happen to be the people that ended up being described with the fixed mentality and like this stability. So maybe all of this has a basis in biology, which is a fascinating insight. And you can imagine that if you're hardwired to be wary, being constantly anxious is really stressful. So, wary people would seek the security of the familiar and the predictable. Others that have less hardwiring for vigilance could possibly actually be hardwired to seek variety and novelty. Maybe that's what spins their wheels much more than the same old, same old. So I find that all very fascinating. So how do you conclude, detect what worldview a person has, fixed or fluid? Well, they figured out that when you talk to people about children, their attitudes about children have great explanatory power. And ever since 1992, many opinion surveys have been embedding sort of a stealth survey where they embed 4 questions about child rearing inside of a much larger opinion survey. And with those questions, they're asking the responders to choose between 2 traits, indicating which is the more important for the child to have. Now, people feel that all the traits are important, but by being forced to choose and rank them, then they reveal how they rank their priorities and their values in life. So the choices are in one question is to indicate what you think is more important, that children respect their elders or that children exhibit independence. Another question is what's more important, self-reliance or obedience? A third question, what's more important for children to display, good manners or curiosity? And then the fourth is which is more important, children being considerate or children being well behaved? So since the definition of a fixed worldview is that the person is very wary of dangers, it makes sense that giving children a lot of leeway might endanger them, and thus if you answer these by preferring respect for elders and obedience and good manners and being well behaved, those are signals of a person who wants order and predictability to their world, i.e., that would be a fixed personality. So this has been embedded in many surveys for 2.5 decades now, and they have a large sample size, and so they can put them over a distribution. And maybe surprisingly, it's not common for people to be totally one way or another. You can, as they create this distribution, if you're answer 4 ways that indicate fixed and 0 fluid, then they say that you are strongly fixed, or vice versa. 0 and 4 would be strongly fluid. But actually, most of the people are somewhere in the middle. A big takeaway here is that when you look at the distribution, there's actually a little bit of a slant, a leaning in America towards the fixed point of view, which would align more with a conservative viewpoint. And if you drew a line straight down the middle here, it's like 55% of the people would be to the left of this midpoint, which is actually more of the right as we talk about politics, but more conservative, and only 45% to to the right of the midpoint with the fluid, which would align with liberals. So I think that's an interesting insight too. Now, it didn't used to be that the political parties aligned really strongly with these personality types and these value systems. If you look back in 1992 when they first started doing these surveys, it was much more balanced. And for instance, in 1992, 49% of the people that answered fixed in those surveys, 49% were actually Democrats. And of the fluid people, 36% of fluids were actually Republicans. But you skip forward up into 2016, and now the fixed and the fluid have sort of gravitated to their natural home parties, where 60% of the fixed people are Republicans and 71% of the fluid people are Democrats. This realignment or purification of the parties was not actually an accident. This was sort of a deliberate thing done by the parties. They concluded somewhere, I think, late in the 90s or in the aughts, that appealing to values was a more fertile way to bring people into their party. So whereas back in the early 90s, the 80s, early 90s, you might say that the parties were aligned by economic interests or by class, whereas now they're aligned much more on values and therefore are a little more pure when you're looking at them from these kinds of categorization of people. So we're going to go back into The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, look at a little bit more of what he was talking about. The first point to make is that not all morals have political implications. There's morals that are moral character, and those encompass concepts like honesty and integrity, and that's automatically going to be part of any moral system. You don't have moral systems where they say, oh, we don't care at all about honesty. It doesn't work that way. So those are not variable or controversial. Those are part of any moral system. What's more interesting is moral behaviors that are dependent upon cultural values and thus have a societal aspect and thus have important political implications. Those are the ones that are more interesting to study and think about because those can vary, in fact do vary, because cultural values vary. So Jonathan Haidt and some collaborators came up with this theory, this framework that they call moral foundation theory. It starts with some of the things we said a little earlier, which is that intuitions about harm and fairness are universal values and they have deep psychological roots. But other morals and values are derived from culture and can vary dramatically from place to place. But eventually, even the culturally determined morals and values, eventually they become intuitively understood too. So let's look at their framework here. This is the moral foundation theory. He came up with 6 categories or factors that we use to sort of form our opinions and theories about the political life, about social life. And the first category, each one of these has a kind of a positive aspect and a negative aspect. The first one is care versus harm. And so we're looking for virtues like caring and kindness. The second category is liberty versus oppression. Now, on the oppression side, it's sort of the do not oppress. We're looking for virtues like not abusing your power and not being a bully. That's what we want. On the third factor is comparing fairness versus cheating. And so we're looking for virtues like fairness and justice and trustworthiness. Then there's another category called loyalty versus betrayal, where for a lot of people, virtues of loyalty and patriotism and self-sacrifice have a lot of meaning. There's another category of the comparison between authority and subversion. And in that category, you're looking for virtues like obedience, deference. That can be important to people. And then the last one he calls sanctity versus degradation. And this is where virtues like temperance, chastity, piety, cleanliness are part of that. So those are the 6 categories, and a sort of a generic way of thinking about them. But the point is that the 2 different sides, liberals and conservatives, will think of these a little bit differently. And so we're going to first look at how liberals look at all of these factors. And there's 2 things we need to look at, is how liberals interpret these factors, and then maybe even more importantly is how liberals prioritize these factors. And what you'll see here as you look on the left-hand side, that there's a couple factors that liberals give a pretty high relative rating to. It's the care harm and the liberty oppression. And then beyond that, the priorities are markedly lower. And so those are a little bit less important to liberals. As far as how liberals interpret these, care and harm are really pretty straightforward. There's not a real lot of nuance there. But on liberty and oppression, what liberals are really have their radar out, are really keen about, is on the oppression side. And so they're defending underdogs, and they're defending victims and powerless groups, and they're really vigilant about protecting group rights. And this is a high priority. He even ranked it probably as the highest priority on the liberal side right now. Then we get down into the more moderate priorities when it comes to fairness and cheating for liberals. Fairness to them is pretty much the same as equality, with really minimum caveats. When you get down to loyalty and betrayal, there's a little bit of a twist on this for liberals, which is they believe that all groups, irrespective of national boundaries, have a right to a place at the table. It's sort of a universalism look. And so actually what this is a little bit of a vigilance and a concern about maybe an over-prioritization of loyalty. So they're kind of on guard for overzealous loyalty, because it would impinge upon this value that they have, this universalism. On authority and subversion, liberals are really kind of uncomfortable with hierarchy and power imbalances and inequality. So this is another one where they're a little bit on guard for an excessive concern about authority. And then the last one, sanctity and degradation. For liberals, there's actually very little emphasis on this. For instance, the body is to be enjoyed. If anything is sacred, it would be nature. So that's the liberal worldview in this moral foundation theory. And to repeat, the main point is that there's 2 that matter a lot, and then there's 4 that don't rank quite as high for liberals. Now we'll look at conservatives, and the first thing to note is over on the rankings, they're all about the same. And this is a very keen insight from Jonathan Haidt, and a very important insight, which is for conservatives, all these things matter, and they matter almost equally. And that's different from liberals. Not only that, but on a lot of these, conservatives interpret these things a little bit differently. Care and harm is actually kind of similar between the two. But when it comes to liberty and oppression, for conservatives, the focus is more on that liberty side. And so they're focusing on personal rights. Don't tread on me, don't tread on my business, don't tread on my nation. That's a big focus for them and a high priority. On the fairness and cheating, the point here is that for conservatives, fairness isn't equality. Fairness is proportionality. So it's related to contribution, and this is where the deservingness that conservatives are very vigilant about, because for them, fairness is proportional to your contribution. It's not equality without caveats or without conditions. On loyalty and betrayal, this is ranked higher for conservatives. They do value loyalty and preference to your group all the way up to the national level. So nationalism actually has a role and a value to conservatives more than to liberals, probably. Authority and subversion are also very highly ranked. In fact, the way Jonathan Haidt was tallying up, authority is the highest of all of these priorities for conservatives. It was far lower for liberals. What conservatives believe is that it's important to have an authority hierarchy that takes responsibility for maintaining order and justice. And this is a big priority for them, is respect for authority, following the rules, that kind of thing. Sanctity versus degradation, again, has pretty high ranking for conservatives. And, whether God exists or not, people feel that some things and some actions are noble and pure and elevated, and other actions and other things are more base and polluted and degraded. And for some of these people, the body is sacred. The body is like a temple. It's not a utilitarian machine. So hedonism is frowned on in this worldview. So we'll just kind of review, we'll overlay the relative priorities of those 6 different factors between the two worldviews. First, we'll focus here on the more prominent red line there, where you see it's pretty much flat all the way across, which is indicative of what I was saying, is that all of those things matter, and they all matter about the same. That's contrasted with the more prominent blue line, which is the kind of straight down the middle liberal, where the first 2 factors had a very high priority, have a much higher priority than they do for conservatives. But then when you get into factors 4 through 6, they have a much lower priority, and in fact a lower priority than conservatives. So you can see that when things are being evaluated through these lenses, the two political ideologies are just not going to be seeing eye to eye because they don't prioritize things the same. They don't care about the same things in the same ways. So it's very natural that there's a lot of disagreement about a lot of things. So there was some studies that were reported in the book The Righteous Mind that sort of demonstrated how these priorities pop up in real life. The first study, they obtained texts from dozens of sermons that were delivered to Unitarian churches and then dozens more that were delivered to Southern Baptist churches. And then they isolated keywords in those sermons that were related to each of the moral foundation categories we just looked at. They found that Unitarian preachers made greater use of care and equality words in their sermons, while Southern Baptist churches were making greater use of loyalty and authority and sanctity words. So these priorities and relative importances were showing up in everyday life as the types of things that we think about and want to talk about. Another study involved people telling their life story, and when they were asked to account for the development of their own religious faith and their moral beliefs, conservatives underscored deep feelings about respect for authority and allegiance to one's group and purity of self, whereas liberals emphasized their deep feelings regarding human suffering and social fairness. The thing here is that when people are just telling stories about themselves, their life story, they almost don't know. They're not even conscious of what they're revealing about themselves, and so he felt that this was fairly legitimate reflection of what was important to these people. And then the third study that I want to talk about was a little bit more scientific. They did brainwave studies to measure the instant reactions to sentences that had embedded concepts from either the positive or the negative versions of those foundation categories. And within like the first half second of hearing a statement, the brains were already reacting, which supports the theory that it's intuition that is having the first shot at deciding what it thinks about things. The intuition of the elephant is the first thing that is hearing what is in those sentences. And but the thing that was really instructive here was that liberal brains showed more instantaneous surprise compared to conservative brains in response to sentences that rejected care and fairness concerns. And they also showed more surprise in response to sentences, this is liberals, so if sentences endorsed loyalty or authority or sanctity, that was immediately noticed by the liberal brains as sort of surprised that those would be endorsed so strongly. So this is another indication that what we're talking about are really intuitions and value judgments that are being done below the level of cognitive reasoning. It's the elephant that's hearing these things. So now let's pivot to the third book we're focusing on in part one, which is Moral Politics by George Lakoff. And he first published this book in 1996. And when I read it, I was just so enthused about it because I thought he had some really novel and useful insights into what's behind the belief systems of conservatives and liberals in America. And as I try to, capture in my mind, understand in my mind, all the points that moral politics was making, I think that it does come back to a worldview. And this may or may not have been very explicitly isolated by Lakoff in his book, but that the conservatives have a worldview that life is hard and dangerous. And my pithy little saying to sum up that worldview is survival of the fittest. This is, the social Darwinism view of the world that I think is sort of the center root that everything else grows out of from the conservative worldview. I don't think you'll find exactly those phrases in moral politics, but I think it gets the gist of what he was hinting around about. On the liberal side, it's always awkward to talk about liberal values because sometimes it's really just a contrast to conservative values. It's like conservatives believe this and liberals don't. So it, but I like these consolidated, concise ways of summing up things, and so I wanted to find something that represented liberals, represented the essence of what Lakoff was saying in moral politics. So I decided that a way to describe this is that liberals think that yes, life is hard, but life is sometimes unfair. And because life is sometimes unfair, we need to help others. So my pithy little summation of the worldview is we are our brother's keeper. Now this is actually me maybe embellishing on the message and the scholarship in this book, and it's maybe overlaying a little bit of my personal evolution, because that was actually the deciding point for me when I was younger and trying to figure out where my allegiances lied politically. I grew up in a conservative Republican family, and I eventually became more liberal and a pretty consistent Democrat. And the difference, the key was when I got to the point where I concluded that life is sometimes unfair, that there are, structural impediments to achieving the American dream that on the conservative side, I didn't think they acknowledged appropriately. So this whole thing about fair or unfair, I think makes a real big difference. And I think that, so I'm going to be referring back to that quite a bit. Again, that's not directly out of moral politics, but I think it's in the spirit of it. So these are the fundamental worldviews that I think are the root of everything. And similar to Prius and Pickup, this also makes some assumptions about human nature. And what Lakoff thinks is that for the conservative worldview, where you think life is hard and dangerous, you have an opinion about human nature that is actually not very generous, which is you think that by nature people are selfish and hedonistic and egotistical, whereas on the liberal worldview, we're maybe a little more generous about human nature, and we think that people by nature just want to be valued and cared for. So this is kind of just some fundamental different roots that everything is growing from. What's your base assumption about the world and what's your base assumption about people? And then we build from there. So there's a theory about if, in this kind of world and these kind of people, what motivates people. Over on the conservative side, the assumption here is that people will do the right thing for rewards, and people will avoid doing the wrong thing to avoid punishment. So reward and punishment is a big part of the worldview over there. Furthermore, rewarding wrong behavior harms people by removing their motivation to improve themselves. And then lastly, in this worldview, past behavior is a predictor of future behavior. Basically, they believe that once you become an adult, it's sort of baked in. Your character is your character, and to expect you to change your colors is a bad bet. So, for the liberal worldview, what do they think motivates people? Well, they think that people will do the right thing for approval, and that people will avoid doing the wrong thing if they develop empathy. Now, the thing to notice here is that both of those have a social element to them. Rewards and punishments are kind of individualistic. Approval and empathy all have to do with your relationship to other people. And so this, builds this worldview that the social world is what it's all about, not the individual. Furthermore, in this liberal worldview, they think that a sense of belonging is important for well-being, so they try to nurture that. And then you kind of get a bonus because, if people don't develop empathy, then the powerful will abuse the powerless. But they think the reverse is true, that if you do develop empathy, then you will be inhibited, you'll be reluctant to abuse the powerless because of the empathy. So these are some really fundamental assumptions about what the world is like, what people are like, and what they respond to. So what Lakoff is really doing is then he's seeing that this has some important parallels in the family, that there's sort of two different ways of thinking about child rearing and the organization of the family. And so he sees that there's sort of what he calls a strict father model of the family, and then there's a nurturant parent model of the family. And it's lined up with these assumptions about worldview and human nature, but in this family paradigm, so in the strict father model, the most important goal for developing children, for developing people, is to develop self-discipline. And the second most important goal is to develop self-sufficiency. And the third is to develop a respect for legitimate authority. So these fit in pretty nicely with this notion about survival of the fittest. The world is dangerous, it's a dog-eat-dog world. Over on the nurturant parent worldview, which we've already sensed is a little more social, their most important goals is to develop empathy in the individual, that this is a highly valued value and very healthy for the individual and for the community. Their second highest goal is similar. It's developing the capacity for nurturance. And then the third most high goal over in the nurture and parent model is the maintenance of social ties. He takes these family models, these parenting models, and then he projects them onto the public sphere as like a secular morality system. And he calls this strict father morality and nurturant parent morality. And so now these feelings about developing children get extrapolated into the public world to sort of supplement and support and perpetuate that effort. So we want to talk about some, in a general sense, the difference. What's the difference between these two different moral systems beyond what we've already sort of seen as some self-evident things there? But because we haven't gone through the whole thing, it may not be evident yet, but both of these systems include most of the same values, but how the culturally specific moral goals are prioritized. That's what's important, and it's almost the complete opposite between the two. The prioritization of the values is almost reversed. Both systems value most of the same character traits, but have almost completely opposite strategies for developing them. The fundamental differences in the prioritization of the moral goals are due to those basic assumptions about human nature and what life skills are most important and what motivates people. Now, at a sort of a meta level, there are similarities between the two systems. Before I get to that, I guess I had one more point over here on the differences. There's a concept that I want to bring forward from the fixed fluid. I felt that in fixed fluid, the Prius or pickup book, that it was a little bit more clearly articulated this notion that conservatives resist change because what works is a time-tested cumulative wisdom. So they really prize, they're really focused on, what works, which is keeping things the same, really. For liberals, they think that there's always room for improvement. That's progress, they say. And so what works is just isn't, they don't think that life needs to be just frozen and petrified. Just because that worked yesterday doesn't mean that's the way it needs to be done today. So it's another fundamental difference between the two that I think we need to keep in mind. Okay, back to the similarities at the meta level. Both moral systems, the strict father and the nurturant parent, are complete and coherent systems. Both moral systems make total sense to their adherents. The strict father moral goals make total sense if you think that life is the survival of the fittest, and if you think humans are naturally self-interested, and you think people are motivated by rewards and punishments, then this worldview, the strict father worldview, it all makes sense to you. The nurturant parent moral goals make total sense if you think that we are our brother's keeper, if you think humans need to be valued and cared for, and if you think that people are motivated by esteem and belonging and will do the right thing if they develop empathy. So again, they're coherent, complete systems that make sense, but it all depends on what your worldview is. So we're going to start talking about what all these moral goals are that we've sort of been hinting at. And so on the strict father morality, The number one moral goal, he calls it moral strength, and that's an umbrella for things like self-discipline, self-denial, self-reliance, and even standing up to evil. Those are the most important values to cultivate and demonstrate. And I would say that self-discipline is far and away the most important in that list and in the whole morality system of the strict father morality. Over on the nurturant parent, their number one goal is nurturance. And the theory here is the child has a right to nurturance and a parent has a responsibility to provide it. And then you extend that metaphor to the community so that the community members have a responsibility to see that people needing help in their community are helped. So nurturance, top of the list for goals and values for the nurturant parent morality. Second on the list for the strict father morality is moral authority, where someone with legitimate authority sets the standards and then enforces the discipline. In the family, the father is invested with that responsibility of authority, and people that are subject to a legitimate authority need to obey those standards. It's basically follow the rules. Over on the nurturant parent morality, the second most important is empathy. And the theory here is that if you really feel what another person feels, you will want that person to experience a sense of well-being. You will also be less likely to abuse any power you hold over other people. So empathy is a very high moral goal for nurturant parents. Moral order is the third highest on strict father. This will rub liberals a little bit the wrong way. But the theory here is that there is a natural order of dominance in the world, that nature is not totally egalitarian, that there is an order of dominance, and it starts with God has dominance over man. Man has dominance over nature. Adults have dominance over children, and particularly, I'll say more in the past than currently, but males have dominance over females. Maybe dominion, it might be a better, different word. I think we've heard that, man has dominion over nature. So respect for and maintenance of that natural order is moral and appropriate, because this is the way the world is from this point of view. Again, it's sort of it's a survival of the fittest. It really does relate to the natural world where power and strength and dominance really matter. And so you need to respect where the inherent strengths are in your society. Over on nurturant parent morality, self-nurturance is third on the list. And the theory here is that you can't care for others if you don't care for yourself. So you need to take care of your health and your fitness, etc. Now, there is a careful balance being sought here between taking care of yourself and taking care of the children you're responsible for. So you can't just be totally self-absorbed, spend all the time on yourself. That's not the point. But the opposite isn't true either. You can't totally neglect yourself and spend all your time looking after the children, because you're just not going to, your job is to take care of yourself so you can take care of them. So it's a very high priority over there. Strict father morality. They have a thing that he calls moral boundaries. this is where the stick with what works type of thing, that they believe there's a tried and true path to success, and straying off of that path is impermissible. That's the wrong path. There's a right path. And if you get off that, you're on the wrong path. And if they don't call you on it, if you're not condemned for straying off the path, then you may lead others off the path. And so we can't let that happen. So they're very vigilant against, this is the way it's done because that's the way it's always been done and it works. Oh, I should have not clicked on that. Social ties. I remember the point back there was that it's really important in the nurturant parent morality to maintain social ties. It's a pretty straightforward priority for them. So number 5 on the strict father morality, they call it moral essence. They feel that virtues bred in a person early in life coalesce as one's essential character, and it's assumed that someone with poor character in adulthood is not going to change their colors. They can't be changed or rehabilitated, or at least the odds are not good for that. So they don't put much credence or priority into trying to fix people that by the time they get to adulthood have not developed good character. Over on the 5th highest on nurturant parent is self-development. This isn't another word for self-nurturance. This is actually development of the child's self. And so this is things like prioritizing education and developing artistic skills and having them do community service. All these things can increase empathy and make the child happy and more nurturant themselves. So that's important to them. Moral wholeness. The theory here is there's no such thing as progress in morality. What is or is not moral is fixed for all time. These are just like natural laws. You don't make it up as you go, and you don't change your mind about what's moral and what's not moral. And that if people are trying to change the rules of the game and change this, the consensus about what is moral, then you need to nip that in the bud, because that's going to get us off on the wrong track again. So moral decay must be stopped as soon as possible. Another high value over in the nurturant parent morality is happiness. The theory here is that unhappy people are less likely to be empathetic and nurturant than happy people are, since they probably don't want people to be happier than they are. So pursuing happiness is a moral thing as long as one does not hurt anyone in the process. Moral purity, back on the strict father morality. What I wrote here is, just as physical impurities can ruin a substance, so moral impurities can ruin a person or society. It's a little unclear exactly what the point there was, but it seemed to fit a slot in how people decide what's good and right in that moral systems. Over on the nurturant parent morality, fair distribution, number 7 on the list of moral goals. And the point I want to make here is that particularly in a societal sense, what is fair distribution is actually really complicated. There are a lot of legitimate ways to define equality. They don't all lead to the same place. And that multiplication is okay. It's natural. And you think about in the family where some kids just need more help, need more attention than other kids, and it's entirely appropriate to give them more help, give them more attention. So you don't have to be completely equal with all your kids in a very strict sense of equality. The point is that needs-based fairness is actually a legitimate way to determine fairness and equality. It can be conditional like that. Back on strict father morality, moral health. Just as disease can spread through contact, so can immorality spread through contact. And so the idea here is that separating yourself from immoral people is actually moral, because there's sort of your job is to create the best you, and if being too much influenced by immoral people is holding you back or diverting you, then that's messing up the program. So it's actually right for you to dissociate yourself from immoral people so that you can focus on creating the best you that you can. Over on nurturant parent, moral growth, they think that adults actually are capable of moral growth after they've reached adulthood, either through help or through work on themselves. So they actually believe in humane treatment of prisoners, and that can lead to moral growth, and they believe in rehabilitation. So they're much more optimistic about human nature in that regard. On strict father morality, number 9 on the list here, self-interest. Somehow I think that it should have been higher on the list. But one way to put in this value of self-interest on the strict father morality is that wealth is actually part of well-being. And if each person seeks to maximize his or her own wealth, then the wealth of all will be maximized, and thus the well-being of all will be amplified. Furthermore, interfering with the pursuit of self-interest is seen as immoral. Back on nurturant parent morality, here we have a category he calls moral strength. It's different, really. The definition of it is different than over on strict father morality. And the way I worded this is that the personal weaknesses that must be confronted are those that interfere with the higher priority moral goals like nurturance and empathy. So the point is a little vague here, but what it means is that a lot of your individual foibles and quirks and actually behaviors and practices, we're not that concerned about that. We're not all hung up about that, as long as you're able to fulfill your responsibilities towards the community and towards other people. And so that's where we draw the line. If these personal weaknesses are getting in the way of you fulfilling those roles, then those are the ones that, yes, you need to work on that. You need to do better. I'd also note that in this category of moral strength, it's a sign of moral strength to extend nurturance to people with different values than your own, and including different moral values. That is showing moral strength. Back on strict father morality, they have a category of nurturance. It's defined a little differently than it is over on nurturant parent morality. In the strict father morality, nurturance is more of a reward for obedience and self-control, and you withhold nurturance as a punishment for disobedience or lack of self-control. That latter is considered to be tough love, which we've all heard of. So nurturance is kind of conditional in the strict father morality. Over on the nurturant parent morality, number 10 was moral boundaries. And what this is a little bit similar to one thing I was talking back on moral strength, but in the nurturant parent model, they have prohibitions against actions with anti-nurturant consequences, and that can be extended to society-wide issues like polluting water or inducing teenagers to smoke or not taking care of nature or whatever. So that's where the boundaries are on behavior and right living, is that you shouldn't be doing things that have an adverse impact on other people and on society. If they don't, then you're in bounds, but if they do have an impact on other people, then, or an adverse impact, then that's over the line. That's where the boundary is for the nurturant. Self-defense is a part of the moral system, the strict father morality. And the notion here is that the strict father model comes with really strict notions of what is good and what is evil and what is right and what is wrong. And there's only one way of doing things. There's a right way of doing things. And that defending that moral system, the defense itself is moral. You actually have an obligation to defend the system because there's only one right way to do it. And you mustn't let it get chipped away at or supplanted. Back on nurturant parent morality, we do have a category called self-interest. It's similar to what we talked about on moral boundaries. Liberals define boundaries around the pursuit of self-interest. So self-interest isn't unbounded. There's limits to self-interest. And they extend this into the public sphere by saying that, for instance, the goals of business should include the well-being of employees, not just profit. So if you're making a profit to the detriment of by abusing your employees, then that's not appropriate expression of self-interest. There's actually one more over on the nurturant parent morality. This is about moral authority, and in this context, moral authority, particularly in the family, is earned by fulfilling your nurturant obligations and gaining trust. Authority is shared between the parents, but the parents explain to their children why the decisions serve the cause of protection and nurturance. So you're working on building trust, gaining trust, and you're kind of teaching your children as you're going along about what the values are and the reasons behind things, because you're trying to build people that when they become adults, they will be nurturant themselves and have know the reasons behind doing certain things. So it's sort of all tied together. It's a cycle, a virtuous cycle here. Now, the parents do have control. The kids can't veto because you didn't, you explained your reason and it didn't make sense to me, or You know, you haven't gained my trust. But the point is that you go through the motions and you work on developing the trust, and you work on explaining your actions so that eventually it can take hold. So those are all of these moral goals that were being pointed out in this book, Moral Politics. And so we're going to kind of sum up what the right kind of person in this strict father philosophy is. The model system for conservatives, it fits a kind of elaborate mythology. These model citizens have succeeded through hard work. They have earned whatever they have through their own self-discipline, and they deserve to keep what they have earned. Now, part of the mythology is that these model citizens have been given nothing by the government. They are self-made people. And thus the American dream is alive and well for people with this worldview, that any honest, self-disciplined, hardworking person can also be successful. That's their worldview. The vision of the right kind of person and the right kind of society in the nurturant parent worldview is someone who lives a socially responsible life. They are empathetic. They help the disadvantaged. They protect those who need protecting. They promote and exemplify fulfillment in life. And they take care of him or herself so he or she can do all of this. That's the ideal person in that worldview. So how would you see the strict father morality being demonstrated in everyday living? Well, first of all, success is a sign of having obeyed legitimate authority and practiced the self-discipline and developed the self-reliance. So success is sort of the marker. If you have success, then it means that you did these things. It's also important to punish improper behavior, because remember, punishment is a motivator. Unearned rewards undo this whole dynamic and thus are immoral. If people are being rewarded without earning that, then your whole motivation system just falls apart. So that's not right. Competition is good. Impeding competition likewise removes an invaluable development tool. So they don't like that. And they acknowledge that in a meritocracy, some people will inevitably be better off than others, and they believe they deserve to be. Furthermore, people should accept the consequences of their own irresponsibility or their lack of self-discipline. And I mentioned this near the end before, but in this worldview, nurturance is closer to a reward instead of an unconditional good. So that's the application into everyday living. What does applying nurturant parent morality look like applied to everyday living? Well, it's belief that children become responsible, self-disciplined, and self-reliant through being cared for and respected, and through themselves caring for others. This is how you build the right kind of people. The obedience of children comes out of their love and their respect of their parents. It does not come out of fear of punishment. And there's a belief that a securely attached child will be motivated to please their parents and to display mastery and to gain respect. So this is the motivation cycle in this worldview. If the parents' authority is to be legitimate, they need to tell their children why their decisions serve the cause of protection and nurturance. So there's We talked about that before, that you're working on building trust, and then you're explaining things to your kids so they understand the why of all these things. For children to become nurturing themselves, they need to develop a social conscience, and cooperation is stressed instead of competition. And the principal goal of nurturance is for children to be fulfilled and happy in their lives, and then to become nurturant themselves. It's a pay it forward philosophy. Furthermore, a person who has developed empathy and has maintained social ties will value fairness very highly. So this is applying nurturant parent morality to everyday living. Now we've just looked at 3 different models of like political theory. We had the righteous mind with the moral foundation. We had Prius or pickup with the fixed and fluid, and we had moral politics with the strict father and the nurturant parent. So how do you apply the different models of values and morality? How do we choose which model of values and morality to explain political beliefs? Well, my answer is all of them. That all 3 of these models are complementary, and that they each have explanatory value, and they each leave some gaps that maybe are filled by the others. So here's my superficial attempt to categorize the applicability of each of those models. First, Prius or pickup. This is that fixed versus fluid. And I say that this is oriented in biology, and that it's describing instinctive criteria that are used to decide what's beneficial and what's harmful. And ultimately, it describes kind of passive reactions of people and maybe defensive adaptations that they make, particularly for the fixed. Ultimately, I think this is maybe the source of opinions about what we like or dislike. So that will be compared here to the righteous mind with the moral foundation theory that I see as being oriented in sociology, and that this is intuitive criteria to be used to decide right from wrong. And it's trying to balance the interest of the individual with the interests of others, again, because it's sort of a social orientation. And that this would be the source of opinions about what is good or bad, which is a little bit different from what we like or dislike. And then we have moral politics, the strict father and the nurturant parent, which I see as being oriented in psychology. And that these are reasoned rules that apply to developing character and developing attitudes of successful people. So you're proscribing personal character goals and proactive adaptive strategies for achieving those goals. And that this would be the source of opinions of what to do and what not to do, or what to be or what not to be. So you can see how these really have their separate lanes of the highway, and they sort of complement each other. So we've got biology, sociology, and psychology. We've got instinctive and intuitive and reasoned. And then we have likes, dislikes, good and bad, what to do, not to do. So again, they all describe something different, but they're all important. They all have a piece to the puzzle. That's how I make sense of all of these. That is the end of the first part of this 3-part lecture series. If you found that interesting and I've piqued your interest, then I would encourage you to look for part 2, and we'll pick up by applying those moral politics, moral goals to everyday political issues. So hope to see you again in part 2. Thank you for watching my presentation.